Hi, welcome to this special episode of ThursdAI podcast. My name is Alex Volkov. I'm the host of ThursdAI, and I gotta be honest, many of the topics covered in this episode were way above my head. Honestly, I was really appreciative and surprised when Enrico reached out and said, "Hey, me and some co-authors on this incredible paper, do you want us to join ThursdAI?" And I was like, yes. So we had a interview with News Research, Karan, LDJ, and Enrico previously, before LLaMa 2 was released. And since then, these guys extended LLaMa 2 from its original 4,000 tokens context length by 2 orders of magnitude to an incredible 128,000 tokens in context length. That's insane. That's considered 2 books, basically. And they did this using this yarn method. So previously we've talked about rope scaling, rotary positional embeddings, and this is the extension of that method. YARN stands for yet another rope extension method. Is a compute-efficient method to extend the context window of large language models, requiring 10x less tokens and 2.5x less training steps than previous methods. They also show that YARN exhibits the capability to extrapolate beyond the limited context of a fine-tuning dataset, right? So what this means essentially is that extenders don't have to train on long sequences to get the model to understand long sequences. Think of a book like The Great Gatsby, which is around 60, 70,000 tokens, give or take. With YARN, models can be trained on 4K sequence length datasets and still understand a prompt of that length, which is incredible. This extrapolation is incredible. It essentially makes it that much easier to train very high context window open models. Finally, we cover what's next for context windows in open source and closed source models, what's next for News Research team, and with that I give you our interview with Bowen Peng, Enrico Cipolle, and Jeffrey Kusnell. And I want to extend a huge thanks for folks who joined this live recording, and obviously for the 4 authors of this incredible paper. Here we go. So we now have this new segment in ThursdAI where we go in depth into interviews. So you are welcome to check out our previous interview, actually with Enrico and some folks from News Research, about extending LLaMa using rope scaling methods. And today we have Enrico, we have Bowen, we have Emozilla, and we know that LLaMa 2 is now possible with 128,000 context window, where the basic LLaMa was released with 4,000 context window. So that's a few orders of magnitude more than the basic one. The top GPT-4 is 32K, and most of us don't have access to that, right? GPT 3.5 is 16,000 context window, and my personal favorite, the hugest one, at least from my experience, is Claude 2, which has 100,000 token context window, which is very useful when you're pasting, let's say, the transcription of all of this space of a 2.5 hour space. You can paste in one go and ask the model to do stuff for it. And so now we have this incredible effort by these folks to extend the LLaMa 2 context window to 128K. So I want to welcome Emozilla, Enrico, and Bowen. And Enrico, there's another author on this that's also should join, but I don't see him. Can you tell me who exactly?
His name is Honglu, but he was in it earlier. I'm not sure if he's still here now.
I see. Well, if you guys can invite him, I'll definitely add him on. But meanwhile, I would love to ask you guys, first of all, any of you, please feel free to briefly explain rope scaling. And keep in mind that our audience is not like the in-depth folks who like multiply matrices in their heads. So a brief explanation of rope scaling, which we already done, and then how YARN is connected to this. I would love to hear from Emozilla and then Bowen as well. Or Bowen, go ahead, and then Emos.
Yeah, okay, sure. I'm a machine learning researcher and computer graphics researcher. So I do like research work mostly. So I read papers, I implement algorithms for others. And so, yeah, I'm not like, unlike you guys, I'm not that into deployment or writing the actual code for the GPU, but I'm more like using PyTorch, like writing down the math. Do you want me to talk about positional encoding in general, or?
Yeah, give us a brief review and recap of rope and positional encoding, and then how this evolved into yarn. We'll talk about the implementation for LLaMa.
If you guys know about attention, there's like inherently there's no positional encoding in attention. So if you give attention 10,000 tokens, it just treats it as a bag of words. Like it just treats it as a set of 1,000 words, doesn't understand about the order, like about anything. So you need to inject some kind of special encoding inside of the vectors. So inside of the dimensions of the tokens, like if the tokens are, let's say, 64 dimensional embedding inside of the network, like each token. So you have a 1,000, let's say we have 1,000 contexts and a 64 dimension per token. So you have a big matrix of 1,000 by 64. And you need to encode positional data inside of each of the 64 dimensions. So usually with positional encoding, we add some number. Let's say we just add a 1 for the first one and add until 1,000 for the last one, right? That would work, but because of how neural networks they work, like they do dot products. You do dot products with all of the attention. So dot products is basically just looking at the difference of the angle between two vectors. So that's a dot product. A good way of encoding positional encodings inside of the network is to use rope, rotational encoding. So you rotate the vectors by a certain amount. And when you do dot products, because of how the vectors are rotated, the network can understand the distance between two words, right? So if you have two words that are really close together by rotation, so the vectors are really close, you know that they are close together inside of the network. Yeah, the network knows that they are close together. If you have two words that are really far away, they are rotated really far apart. So then they are really expanded. You know they are far away, so maybe they are not so useful to predict the next word. So the network, when you give it these embeddings, it kind of learns about the distribution of how the rotations are. Like the network, when it sees some rotation that is out of bound, it doesn't understand what's happening. So that's why we need to use interpolation to do more than 4,000 contexts. Because with 4,000 contexts, it only had some amount of rotation between all of the words. And anything beyond that rotation, the network is like, I don't understand. I cannot. It never seen that in the data. It doesn't understand at all. So for any kind of rope interpolation, what we're doing is instead of rotating more after 4,000 token for LLaMa 2, we actually rotate less for anything less than 4,000. So if you have, let's say, 10,000 contexts, you just compress all of the 10,000 into the 4,000 rotations. So the network is now able to figure out better during fine-tuning that we are looking at what place and what not, right? That is just like how interpolation works.
So first of all, thank you for the explanation. So attention is very important, and also there was an issue of attention across the whole context window, correct? So I think when rope came out, Ophir Press, the guy from LLaMa, which is the guy behind LLaMa papers, which is also a way to extend context, and I think some labs use LLaMa, he expressed kind of a concern whether or not there's a full attention across the whole context window after rope. Is that correct? Could you speak to that a little bit? Whether or not like this attention is spreading evenly across the whole context window with rope and with yarn as well?
So for rope, the problem that I think he's alluding to is that rope decays long context attention. So because of how dot products work, so the further two vectors are rotated apart, the less the result, like after the dot product, is much less. So the attention is actually, it's reducing the attention for all the tokens that are far apart, right? So the more tokens are far apart, 2 tokens, the less attention they have between the two. So that might be a problem if you think about it, but one thing is that when we do interpolation, we're actually not rotating more than that. So if, for example, the network can attend to 4,000 context size, if you compress like 10,000 tokens inside of the 4,000, it should be in theory capable of attending to all of the tokens, because the rotations are not more, they're less actually. You have less rotations between each of the vectors.
So next question. So you explained about rope, and you guys have worked on, so rope was used to extend LLaMa to, I want to say 16K real quick, and Rico, please remind me if I'm mistaken, but like very quick after LLaMa released, you and some other folks, I think, extended it to 16K. Was that correct? Like a few days after?
Yeah, so
Yes.
rope actually by itself is not extending anything. Like rope is the encoding of how you encode the positional like data inside of the embeddings. So the tokens, by using rope, we can add a position to all of the tokens. Like the network knows which tokens are where. But the simplest interpolation method that they used, like before Yarn, was linear interpolation, so positional interpolation. So basically, we just say that the token at 10,000 is now at 4,000. So you compress every distance. Like it's just you stretch the line. You compress or you stretch the line, basically. Because rope is taking like a point on a line, so between 0 and 4,000, like for LLaMa 2, it expanded into a multi-dimensional complex vector. So that's actually just how rope works. It takes 1D position on a line and just expand it into a ND complex vector, so the network can attend to all of the tokens, know where all the tokens are. So linear interpolation is just compressing that 1D line. So you just take a let's say 16K, you compress into 4K and you give it to the network. So that's basically just it.
And this, I will comment that the idea of doing this was sort of the key thing that has kicked this length extension, bonanza that we found ourselves in. Up until now, it wasn't clear exactly if there would be a way to train models to go longer other than actually just training them to go longer. Like that was sort of, we were stuck at that level, but that involved a lot of compute cost. So the original breakthrough was, like Bowen mentioned, the whole point is we need to somehow tell the model where things are. And in our mind, it's very simple. It's a one-dimensional line that you word 0, word 1, word 2, word 3, word 4, right? It's very simple. It's exactly what we want the model to learn, the differences between the spacing. But because of the way attention works, it actually is using these dot products in complex vector space. So you need to do some fancy math, basically take that simple line and sort of thread it through this hyperdimensional complex. And that is what rope is doing. It is essentially being like, we know this hyperdimensional complex space is going to look like this. Here's the math so that when you can like literally take this like rope and run it through this hyperdimensional space, that will essentially encode the idea of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like this linear number assigned to each of the tokens. And so the key that Kaioken Dev discovered was that we can take this rope, right? And the problem was you got your rope and it's from 0 to 4,000. Now, when you went to 16,000, that rope, you can think of it as exiting the hyperdimensional space and it just sort of falls off and it can't be used at all, right? And that was what we saw. It's like, if you made the rope 4 times longer, we only had rules to like how to get it through to the 4K length. It would exit the hyperdimensional space, fall off, and it would be useless. So the simplest idea, and you might ask why someone didn't think of this, but the simplest ones are obvious once you realize it, is to sort of take that 16K rope or whatever it is and like squeeze it together really, really tight and push it in so that it fit in the same length as that 4K rope, right? And now you've got this much longer rope that's been squeezed into there. And that was what this positional interpolation is. And it took the numbers 1 and 2. If you were making a 4x increase in the length of the context, it would now take the numbers 1 and 2, and they would be like 0.125 and 0.25. And because of the way real numbers work, we can sort of infinitely compress and infinitely divide. And we can take, and we can always make things smaller and smaller because the real numbers are infinite even between 0 and 1, right? So you can always like shrink. And this is what LLaMa or what a paper that Meta came out essentially was a paper that was equivalent to what Kyle and Dev did, which is that this did this. And this was like amazing. It worked. So like it worked, and it took us from it not working at all to we know how to do it. Now we've kind of been like, okay, can we take this further? And the reason is that when you do this squeezing, you still need to train the model a little bit more to like learn. But what's amazing is that the model, after it's been trained at 4K and it sees this like squeezed rope, it very quickly is able to pick up on what happened. It doesn't think that like it's learning anything new or new language. It just goes, oh, I see. Like they decided that everything is now divided by 4. Okay, I can figure out what that means. You know what I mean? The model very quickly understands what you've done. And when you train it for a little bit longer on this scaled one. So everything after that's just kind of been iterative refinements. The key intuition about this is that this linear number this linear rope from 0 to 4K or whatever, we're threading it through this hyperdimensional space. And as we thread it, it's taking these twists and curves. It's like going up and down this hyperdimensional hill, right? And because of that, just squeezing it, it's like think about like at the trough of a hill, it's getting squeezed more than the parts at the top of the hill. Even because if you like squeeze everything by a constant factor, those areas that are in like the bottom of the hill will actually get squeezed more or less. Like that's just this is not at all like what's really happening, but it's an intuition to think that like just scaling it linearly and pushing it together might not be the most optimal way to do this, because it's now no longer a straight rope. It's, weaving up and down this hyperdimensional space is, we can sort of squeeze it very smartly at different points to try to get that same behavior. And that's really what we've been investigating, is like, how can we, now that we know this is what we're doing, sort of the linear scaling is kind of like the blunt hammer. Yes, it works. Okay, great. Now we know that's what we need to do. Let's look at it and say, is there a more clever formula we can use of mapping how to do that sort of squeezing together so that it fits the contour of the space that we're trying to fit this quote unquote rope through.
That's incredible, Imaz, and thank you for this very simplified and colorful explanation. The instinct about what happens in a multidimensional space definitely is not easy to grasp for many folks, especially folks who don't necessarily work with this. But the squeezing of the rope and the fact that it unlocked this thing is interesting. Here, I want to ask you about this. You mentioned Kaiku and Dev. We've talked about Kaiku and Dev, I think the last time we talked about LLaMa as well. And then separately or in parallel, also folks from Meta kind of released a paper that's similar to this. Could you reflect on how that came about just briefly? And then we'll move on to Yarn.
Mm-hmm. So Kyle and Dev posted onto, I think originally on 4chan maybe, and then later on Reddit.
As well,
yeah. And I just kind of out of nowhere said, hey, let's try this. And immediately, like the next day, I tried it, and Gorgon, I get the GGML guy. I remember he tried it too, and he tweeted out, holy shit, no way this actually works. You know what I mean? It was very much, we couldn't believe it was so obvious, and yet no one had thought to do it at the time. A couple of weeks later, Meta dropped this paper called Positional Interpolation, or Context-Aware Extension via Position Interpolation, which basically was like a academic paper that 100% the exact idea. I mean, it's literally the same thing, but it was an actual academic paper that like showed the math formulas. They did lots of ablations, meaning they trained it multiple different ways. They evaluated it on lots of different data sets so that you could see how does it scale as it gets longer. You know, they did a quote unquote proper scientific study of it. There's a little bit of drama, if you want to call it that, because they did not really cite, like, you know what I mean? There was kind of like some misattribution and people might have felt a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. What's interesting, they came out with that paper, and we can, there was an intermediate phase here, knowing that now we needed to do this. Bowen has been researching, you know, new methods, and he put out a couple of, just on Reddit, hey, we can try this, we can try this. One of these was this NTK aware scaling. What's interesting is that CodeLlama uses Bowen's NTK aware scaling to get its long context.
That one has, CodeLlama has 100K context, right?
Well, I mean, it's claimed. So we can get into the details here. And our paper actually did an extensive analysis of this. It was trained, CodeLlama was trained at 16K. But what we found was that, like spoiler-ish, is that unlike the positional interpolation, these new methods actually exhibit the ability to extrapolate. So what this means is that we can train them on shorter sequences, and they can actually go longer than what they were trained on. Previously, LLaMa was really the only positional encoding method that had been given this behavior. But it was these new methods that we have actually extrapolate. Meta discovered this in the sense that we never even thought about really trying it because we didn't think it would happen. But Meta discovered that Bowen's NTK method does extrapolate. And that's what they used for CodeLlama.
I would love to just gently ask about extrapolation again, just to highlight the point. So you're saying before with stuff like linear, right? You had to also fine-tune or train the model on larger sequences, data sets, for it to be able to kind of also understand and respond to them. And now with newer models, you can continue training this with data sets of like 4,000 tokens, lengths, sequences, etc. And you will still be able to read and understand way longer texts and perform well on them.
Yes, that's exactly correct. CodeLlama, although on their front page they say it's 100K, was trained on 16K sequences. So they did train a lot. So it's kind of like you get like a multiplier, right? So like if you train, so for Yarn, we trained on 64K long sequences, but it can do inference up to 128K and probably can do more, but we just couldn't even like do the inference. Like it's just when you get that big, especially at 13B, like it's insane, like the amount of memory VRAM that you need. But yes, that is correct. So these new ones actually exhibit extrapolation, which means that it's even better because you can train on shorter sequences and still get the long context behavior.
That is incredible. And so also incredible the fact that they happened in imagination unlock basically by somebody who just poked a finger. And I remember Kaioken Dev's blog where he said, oh, you know, extend LLaMa with these 2 lines, right? And there's literally like 2 lines of code that you need to change in order to do something. One of them was like to tell it basically to use longer sequences, something like that. I vaguely remember the blog post, but I remember the excitement about this also on Twitter. And we had Yassine before. I think I found it through Yassine, and I think they're also with Kaioken. They found this via 4chan. And I love the fact that somebody who's potentially Anon, I don't know if Kaioken Dev is the docs or not, potentially Anon like pointing to something, and then big labs are releasing full-on scientific research, and then this imagination unlocks certain capabilities that you guys have now used. And so I would love to then follow up and ask about LLoooongMa and how Yarn was used to actually train LLaMa with 128. Like what Mozilla, you talked about compute, and at those sequences, compute is very hard. Is compute significantly harder when you train on dataset that are longer, and Is extrapolation helping to reduce compute and that's needed to get to those sizes?
Yes and yes is the short answer. I didn't mention, and I brought it up many times already, about like how awesome Flash Attention 2 is. It enabled us to do this and reduce our compute requirements significantly. It's sort of an interesting problem because the training methods actually converge very quickly. The model very quickly, like after even like a few training steps, like picks up on what is going on. It doesn't need to be trained for a long time at all. But the problem is that there is a minimum amount of VRAM that you need to do it. And so it's like, you don't need a lot of you need like a lot of VRAM for a very short amount of time. You know what I mean? Was kind of the trouble that we ran into. Enrico did all of the training runs for Yarn on Stability AI's cluster. So thank you, Stability, for that. He can talk a little bit about this training setup that he used for it. But I will say that we trained at 64K, which may have even been a little bit of an overkill, but we wanted to like make the best. We didn't have like a lot of time on Stability's cluster, so we kind of wanted to spend it the best that we could and make the most powerful model that we could in the time that we had. So we did train on 64K, which was the limit that we could train on with the GPU. That was basically like batch size 1 for the amount of GPUs that we had, and it would still fit without out of memory. But if Enrico, you want to talk a little bit about the training setup that we use?
Hello. So what we did is we used fully sharded data parallelism to basically split the model across 64 A100s with 80 gigabytes of VRAM. The thing is that when you're training at sequence lengths that are this large, the sequence length itself ends up taking basically the majority of the VRAM. So even though you're sharding this 7 billion parameter model to 50 billion parameters per GPU and sharding the optimizer states and everything else, the context length itself ends up just filling up the entire memory, which is why we had to use the 80 gigabyte ones. One thing that we're currently working on in the next rendition, now that we're seeing a lot more support for this, and we've actually been building a very custom specific library that is going to be open sourced very soon, just ironing out a few different things before it's put out with help from some of the PyTorch team, is we're going to be able to combine multiple forms of parallelism, such as like tensor parallelism, sequence parallelism, flash attention 2, and fully sharded data parallelism all together to be able to basically distribute the context length as well as shard the parameters both vertically and horizontally across each of these GPUs. So TP would be intranode, FSDP would be internode, and then you have sequence parallelism, which essentially chunks the context length of the 64K window in between each of the GPUs. So no longer are you having the 64K like context window filling up the entire memory of the GPU, because it's going to be basically like chunked in between each of the different nodes, which is going to help the performance and training of this significantly. And now that that is relatively all integrated together, it is going to massively improve the performance of training both regular models and long context models. The benchmarks we've been doing on it so far have shown really promising results. So hopefully that all holds up for release. But the biggest difficulty right now, doing it more naively with only the FSDP and flash attention 2, is that the sequence length hasn't been chunked. As for the data, what we did is we did find that it does make a difference, because when you're training these models, you do not want to have sequences that are too short. I mean, this just basically applies to regular training as well. If you have the LLaMa 2 model that's been trained at 4K, obviously you don't want to start training on sequences that are 2K, because it's going to start adjusting to that lower context length. So we found reliable sources of data that we could use to rapidly iterate on. We chunked them, to the specific sequence length we needed. Together Compute showed in the 32K models that you can also do a bit of in-context learning with packing some of these longer sequences together, and it will still have relatively performant results, which basically goes back to what Jeff was saying too as well, where you can train at the 4K and then just extrapolate. So that's what they were showing with in-context learning, is you can have these shorter sequences. You don't need a bunch of text examples that are 64K tokens, because that's extremely difficult to find just in general. The only real source of long context information is books. The problem with that is you have to find books that are completely commercially viable to use for training. And that is a very difficult thing to do because we wanted everything to be open source.
I want to just, for folks in the audience, just to give some context here, pun intended. I think when, was it Mosaic? They released their, I think, 70,000 context window. They said that The Great Gatsby, the book The Great Gatsby, all of it is 67,000 tokens, right? So you're talking about 64,000 tokens. A whole book is 67, like a short book. Yeah, A Great Gatsby is not War and Peace, but just for context, like you need to find these data sets somewhere, and like the whole books that you're putting in training, right? So yeah, okay. Could you please talk a little bit more about like how you source the data set, like what it went into? Is it open source? I really wanted to dig into the data that is required, and what Imozilla said about in-context learning from smaller data sets to larger ones sounds incredible here, and haven't had this at all, and I would love to hear more about this.
Yeah, so with Mosaic training on those books, I know there was a lot of backlash to that, and we worked very hard to explicitly avoid that and only sourced long context data that is 100% commercially viable and has been licensed. So this is like really important for downstream users as well, because if somebody is to use our long context model, they no longer have to be concerned about the implications of the training data. And that is very important from like a legal standard and like an ethical and moral standard as well. So that's one thing we had to focus on. And there's the Project Gutenberg, which you can find a lot of these long context examples. They're brilliant books. They're in English, so they're perfect for using, and they're all commercially licensable and viable to use, and you don't have any concern training on them or using models trained on them for inference. What Together and LLaMa also found with the in-context learning types of things is that you can pack these shorter sequences together and still be able to extrapolate using something like Yarn, like Imozilla was previously saying. So Together did that, where they found some open source data sets on Hugging Face. They combined, they basically filtered anything under 4,000, I believe, and then combined the long context ones that were like 1632K with a bunch of other examples that were, say, in the 4K, 8K range as well, using the linear interpolation scaling. And they found that they were still getting very good results. Because we wanted to push this to the absolute maximum and hit the 128K mark, we decided to use the Project Gutenberg data set, which has a ton of these books that are 64K plus in sequence length. So basically, even when you're chunking them, the single book isn't even getting packed together. It's basically taking up the entire context window itself. And we found that does help. But you also need to incorporate a lot of these specialized training techniques and things like that if you want to make it operable on GPUs that don't have such a high VRAM.
I want to just ask folks about why, if Meta, or I guess don't speculate as to why, but do you guys foresee that all like newer models will start getting larger and larger context window, or will we still have shorter length context windows then just like the open source community will just join and kind of extend those. Do you guys foresee the kind of the industry, the big labs like OpenAI, etc., and the open source releases like Meta, will they adopt the larger context windows from scratch, so we will get base models that are like this length, or is there something preventative there that will prevent them from doing this? Because Llama 2 was released with 4, but around the same time or even before, they already had an understanding of rope scaling in the strict. Maybe it takes a while to kind of incorporate into their processes. But would love to hear from you folks, Bowen and Emos and Enrico, about speculation towards the future, whether or not the open source models will come out with larger context windows because of these new tricks that you also contributed to.
Yeah, I think that because of how these interpolation methods are all like different, like it's going forward so fast, like we're developing newer methods. I think probably Meta doesn't want to jump the gun, let's say, like they want maybe to wait a bit to get like better methods before committing to one, because when you release, let's say LLaMa, they released the long context version with 100K. If that method wasn't great, if the context extension wasn't done great, they would have to like revert to the older models and fine tune, right? And if they release, let's say, right now they only released the final fine tune. So they had a base model of LLaMa that wasn't trained on 16K context, so only 4K. So it was same as Llama 2. They didn't release that model. So if they had released that model, we could have trained Yarn on it, but they would have to release like 10 models, right? Like 20 models like each time. So I don't think that's like really, they want to do that, because that's really confusing. And we already have 1,000 models on the Hugging Face leaderboard. So I think as it stands right now, like the methods will converge to a good one. There's also, from the authors of Rope, they released a re-rope, which also extend the context size. There's also the infinite LM paper. Like we have a multiple now, like more and more, like as the day goes. And I think as we converge to the best one, a one that's like even more efficient than Yarn or even better, I think they would just release like a infinite context size model. Like just we would have a fine-tuning method that would just allow the model to extend to any context size.
One thing that we kind of have run into as we've been doing this is that everyone thought they wanted long context and until they got it, because ultimately we are still fighting up against the quadratic nature of attention, right? And for everything that happens when it comes time to act, it gets quadratically slower as the context window gets longer. And that is a battle which, you didn't even have to fight, but now like you can fight it, but then you realize that, like I said, to do FP16, we were doing it in FP16, we needed 8 A100s to do 13B at 128K to do inference. There's still a lot of problems, not problems, but just, I think that at this point, we've effectively know we can do limitless context length. And so it's likely actually though that Meta will the next model will play it safe. Well, safe. Maybe they use 8K as the base one and then rely on us, or they do 8K base and then do a longer fine tune like they did with LLaMa with another method. The answer is we know it can be done. We know it works, and we know that the method's only going to get better. But at the end of the day, use you on your machine trying to do, and imagine if you are trying to use the 34B or the 70B at 80K context. It's laughable at this point. Yeah, the restrictive factor is the fact that, okay, you can go long, but can you really go long? You know what I mean? Do you actually have the compute to do it? I think the next frontier for us, honestly, will be something that, whatever it is that replaces attention. There's lots of research on subquadratic attention replacements. And I think that for the next big unlock of large language models, it will be whatever it is that replaces attention with a subquadratic method. There's RWKV. I'm like getting the letters wrong. There's hyena. There are a couple of other methods that are vying to replace attention with a subquadratic operator. If and when that happens, that's when the long context really becomes something that's at this point almost like a bragging or like a theoretical thing, and brings into the realm of usability for everyone. And, we need to do this, but we need to do this research concurrently, which is what's great about this. Our positional encoding research can be applied to a subquadratic attention mechanism that is still dot product based. Lots of these, it's quite possible that we're sort of building separate pieces concurrently, and then once we settle on a replacement for attention that is subquadratic, then that's when it'll really be awesome and heat up. So I wouldn't, and one more final thing, but I'll try to stop talking, is that, and Luigi had mentioned this many times, it's interesting, things are moving so fast that we know when CodeLlama was started getting training because they used the best method that was available at the time. And in the intervening 2 months, 2 better methods had come out, but they'd already started the training run on CodeLlama. You know what I mean? So it's interesting to see how when these training runs happen, whether Llama 3 is already training or not, I don't know. If it is, and they're planning on still releasing it, like Falcon, still using rope. Maybe Falcon 2, if they started training it today, maybe they would use yarn, or they would use. We don't really know what is happening when, but I would not be surprised. My prediction would be that Llama 3 would be like an 8K model, an 8K base model, then trained, then extended with yarn or some other extension method to go to an infinite length. But until we slay the quadratic beast that is the attention, we have to just sort of temper our enthusiasm for what long context actually means.
So I will not temper any enthusiasm because I love long context and I love pasting a lot of text, especially transcriptions from these spaces. But in Mozilla, I share your enthusiasm as well. I think so. Luigi and then Nissan.
Yeah, so there's some big news. While you guys were talking, I try to summarize the news so I can, get it out efficiently. So Adept AI, on their team, they have I think at least one of the authors from the paper, Attention is All You Need, the original Transformer paper. And long story short, just while we were having this pod, they released an 8B model. And so just some summarized notes that I wrote down. It has Apache 2.0 license. It's open source now. And it has double the attention heads of Llama 7B, it seems, which is the same amount of attention heads as Llama 7DB, which should theoretically, I think, improve in context learning based on some Anthropic ICL papers I was reading into. And the vocab tokenizer, has a vocab size of 250,000, which is about 10 times more than Llama 2, I'm pretty sure. And theoretically, that might be able to do better multilingual and mathematics in general. And the actual training only goes for 700 billion tokens. 25% of that is code, but it reaches about the same benchmark scores as Llama 2 7B, which was trained for 2 trillion tokens. So maybe some of the architecture changes, actually help that a lot. And then it has 16K context length with rope. So possibly that opens the possibility for Emo or other people to, extend that even further since they used rope instead of something like Alibi or things like that. Trained natively at 16K context length with rope. So instead of having, so they say that they modified the base rotary calculations for rope to have the full position. They said to allow for full position resolution at this longer length. So I guess instead of scaling it from the original value of 1, at rope equals 1, I guess it's 16K context length, yeah, if that makes sense. And actually, one last thing I noted in my notes is that apparently they say, here, I'll just read the quote, because our vocabulary is larger than that of Llama and MPT, the actual inference speed in terms of characters is likely comparatively higher. whatever we want to take away from that.
That's amazing, and I think it ties our interview with Imas and Bowen and Rico perfectly, because now we're getting a longer model, like a base model from Adept, who's authors of Transformers. The attention stuff that Imas was talking about is basically a Transformers paper, right? Attention is all you need. Some of the authors now using these also methods. I find it incredible. Luigi, thank you for bringing this up. I want to just let folks, Enrico, Imazila, Bowen, just to maybe briefly summarize and say what is else for you, what's next for you, what maybe help from the community you need. Please have the space, and then Nistan, maybe you have a final comment there before they do that.
No, I just want to quickly ask them, since most of the context window was being taken during training and was taking up most of the RAM, but was only needed for a bit, is there any possibility to maybe offload that into the CPU side, since it doesn't see that much processing? I just wanted like any thoughts you had on that, and then yeah, that's all for me.
Yeah, you can definitely offload it. I mean, even during training, you could use offloading. We chose not to because it fit into the GPU like VRAM at 80 gigabytes. You can, as I had previously mentioned too, there's something called sequence parallelism. Again, I still got to figure out how to link things, but I'll put it in the comments. There's a really good paper on chunking the context length and splitting it in between GPUs. So that is something to take into consideration for training as well.
Thanks. I would just like to add, because we've shown with Yarn that it's possible to go to such context lengths, I hope actually that people would, this would hype more the community, you know, because before this, people saw those, there was a paper that said they had 1 billion context length, right? But there was no model, there was no data sets, nothing. Basically, that was just a proof, not even a proof of concept, just theory, right? Like here we have an actual proof of concept that 128 works, 128K works, and I hope that people will do more work on the algorithm side or like the offloading side. Like people would scramble to actually make this run on lower end GPUs, right? Because now we have something. Like it's here, the model is there, like it works. We tested it. So that was just like, I think that by releasing Yarn, it will push the community like to work on better algorithms for the flash attention, or even like some other attention alternatives that we can just plug into LLaMa and then fine tune it. Because right now Yarn is just a small modification, right? We can also take some other attention mechanism and just put it inside and use the same code, just modify the attention a bit. We have all the training code, everything. We can just train a 128K model again with some other algorithm. Yeah. That's basically it. Yeah.
Thank you, Bowen. And I think you just joined Twitter for this, right? Where should folks follow you? Where else can they find out what you're doing and what you're working on?
Yeah, we have the GitHubs, and we have, yeah, you can follow us on GitHub, or even the Hugging Face repos we have at News Research. Yeah.
Awesome. Imazila, go ahead, man.
Yeah. As for what's coming next, we're going to be tidying up the paper. We're going to get it over, hopefully submit it to ICLR, fingers crossed. We have a couple of more, scientific-y stuff we just want to get in the paper to make it as tight as possible. Going on from there, we have lots of exciting things over at News Research that we're working on. We're actually going to, we've kind of been a little bit like closed off, but we're going to be opening up our Discord to the public. Not today, but like very soon. And that'll sort of let everyone come in and chat and talk about it. Bowen and I are just as excited about a bunch of some other things that, especially in the multimodal space, that we want to investigate. So the best way to keep in track with us, we'll get out. You can get News Research on Twitter, or myself, Mozilla, follow any of us, and we'll get everyone into our Discord, and we can, start talking from there. I will be slightly selfish and say that we are still a little bit GPU poor. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. We actually, we got a grant from A16Z to pay for the Yarn training, for the Yarn eval, but It was not a big check. People seem to think we like got this huge amount. It was not. It was awesome for Ange over at A16Z to help us out, but we are still very compute and GPU poor. And so we are actively looking for people who are able to help out with these training runs, because like our yarn models could have been even better. And like we didn't have the ability to do the 70B. We wanted to do the 70B. That's actually, if I had to say a stretch goal, would be finding enough GPUs that someone will let us use so we can do yarn to use the 70B. Or if someone's crazy, we can do Falcon 180B. And so, yeah, we need some GPUs for that. And then Rico is doing an awesome job at making our trainer as efficient as possible so that we don't need as much. I mean, a year ago, we would have needed like 4 times as many GPUs as we actually need now. I do the same thing, but we do need that. So that will be my final sort of ask if anyone can help out. But other than that, yeah, we're going to continue to be releasing and research over at Noose, and follow us along. And I will just comment that it's awesome to be part of the open source community, and everyone is contributing in their best capacity and their best way. And together we've been able to rival the big AI studios. And it's something that sort of we as a collective community are proud of.
That's awesome. And in terms of how to follow, you guys are always welcome on ThursdAI, and I really appreciate the time here, the expertise and the metaphors. Rico, go ahead and we'll close out.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone in the open source community, as well as people who have been helping to sponsor us, such as LLoooooongMa and Stability AI. I know that Lion and Together are also looking to collaborate with us. So hopefully we will be able to continue to expand these models and get the resources we need in the future to get these 70 billion parameter runs out to the community and available for everybody to use. Because if we are able to do, you'll have a very strong open source based model that I mean, just to even thinking about it right now, it's just pretty wild that we've got into this point. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody.
Thank you guys for joining, and thank you, News Research. Folks should definitely follow this. I think in this 2.5, or sorry, I think 3 hours almost exactly, 3 and something, it's time to conclude ThursdAI. We had more breaking news during the space than I think ever before. We just saw a model from Adept AI with the co-authors of the original ThursdAI paper release something that uses some of the stuff that folks on stage here actually kind of proposed and fine-tuned. That was incredible. And Luigi, thanks for bringing this up. We also saw the release of Mojo live during this ThursdAI, which I was waiting for a long time. And we're gonna go and all play around maybe with Mojo and see if some of the stuff that we're already running runs faster on Mojo, maybe opening up other possibilities. And we've talked about Falcon 180B, which is exciting and not as performant for some tasks, but definitely a big thing for the community. But I just want to say thank you for folks who joined, the friends of the past who joined for the first time. Harrison, thank you. Anton, thank you. I think Bowen is your first time. Emo's your first time. Yassine jumped on. It was an incredible space. I want to shout out with the strongest conviction that folks who, the co-hosts that come week after week, Yam and Nistan. Luigi, I can consider you a host at this point. Zanova, who's now in the audience, but also really some beautiful stuff. We're here every Thursday, besides maybe last week I was on vacation. We're here every Thursday. We learn because there's so much around AI. We learn together. We talk about everything we learned. And then everybody who can't make it every Thursday, there's a newsletter that I run in podcast form as well. So you're welcome to follow that if you weren't able to follow all the 3 hours. The interview with the news folks, I think it's incredible, and thank you guys for joining us. And with that, I want to wish you a great ThursdAI, and we'll see you here next week. And thank you all for your attention, quote unquote, and pun intended. And we'll see you next week, and you're all welcome to come back. Thank you so much. Have a good ThursdAI. Bye.